How to choose a liability cap in a SaaS or recurring B2B contract in a rigorous way without using a mechanical formula and without misallocating risk. Today, I want to talk about one of the central issues in B2B contract negotiation, especially in SaaS, the liability cap. The wrong way to approach this issue is to ask, what is the right number? The better question is, what kind of cap structure is actually consistent with the economics of the deal, the nature of the risk, the term of the contract, and the company's real ability to absorb a claim? Because in practice, there is no universally correct cap. There is a cap that fits the deal, and there are caps that are badly calibrated. And a badly calibrated cap usually creates one of two problems. Either it exposes the supplier to liability that is disproportionate to the value of the contract, or it is set so low that it becomes very difficult to defend in a serious negotiation, especially with enterprise customers. In technology and SaaS contracts, a general cap tied to the fees paid over the previous 12 months is extremely common, and suppliers rarely want to go materially above 12 months of fees for the relevant service unless the leverage, the account, or the risk profile clearly justifies it. So the real question is not 12 months, 24 months, 2 times or 3 times. The real question is, what exactly is this cap supposed to cover, over what period, for what category of risk, and with what economic logic behind it? I am going to break this down in a practical way. First, I will explain the 3 main cap structures, then I will show the strengths and weaknesses of each one, then I will give you a method for choosing between them, and finally, I will give you a practical negotiation framework. So, when we talk about a liability cap, we are talking about the maximum financial amount that one party agrees to bear for covered claims under the contract. At this stage, I am not talking about exclusions of indirect damages, carve-outs, or supercaps. I am talking about the general cap. In practice, there are 3 main families of cap structures. First structure, 12 months of fees. The typical wording is, the supplier's total liability under the agreement shall not exceed the amounts paid or payable by the customer during the 12 months preceding the event giving rise to liability. This is probably the most common structure in SaaS. Why? Because it creates a direct link between the revenue actually generated by the contract, the maximum exposure under the contract, and the recent economic life of the relationship. In other words, the more the customer pays, the higher the cap goes. The less the customer pays, the lower the cap remains. Suppliers like this logic for a simple reason: it preserves a form of proportionality between the value of the contract and the level of risk being accepted. Second structure, a fixed amount. For example, each party's total liability under the agreement shall not exceed 250,000 euros. Here, the cap is no longer directly tied to fees. It is set in advance and as an absolute number. This structure appears in certain contracts with limited recurrence, in deals where the parties want budget certainty, where the economics of the contract do not properly reflect the level of risk, or where the parties deliberately want to move away from a purely revenue-based cap. Third structure, a multiple of fees. For example, the supplier's total liability shall not exceed 2 times the amounts paid or payable under the agreement during the previous 12 months, or sometimes 2 times the annual contract value. Here, the parties keep the fee-based logic, but increase it by applying a multiplier. This is often a compromise structure. It allows the customer to say, one-time annual fees is not enough given the risk profile of this contract. And it allows the supplier to remain within a proportional model, without immediately moving to a high fixed cap or to a much broader exposure. So, let's start with the most common standard. Why it is often the right starting point on the supplier side. A 12-month fees cap has several clear advantages. First, it is easy to understand. Everyone immediately sees the logic. Second, it tracks the economics of the deal. If the annual subscription is 100,000 euros, the cap is 100,000 euros. If the annual subscription is 500,000 euros, the cap increases automatically. Third, it works relatively well in recurring contract models. Why? Because in SaaS, the relationship is often ongoing, payments are periodic, and the supplier's exposure is expected to remain aligned with the revenue generated over time. Fourth, it is easy to defend in negotiation. You can say, in a technically sound way, we cannot accept a liability level that is disconnected from the economic value of the contract. The cap needs to remain proportionate to the revenue generated under the service. That position is generally understandable and defensible. But 12 months of fees also has real weaknesses. The first weakness is that it can be artificially low. Take a simple example. You sign a major enterprise customer in year 1 with discounting entry pricing. The account is strategically important. The service may be critical, but the fees paid in the previous 12 months are low, either because the contract has just started or because pricing was heavily discounted. In that situation, the cap can end up far below the level of risk that the customer believes it is taking. The second weakness is that this structure may undercover certain serious incidents. In the contract involves sensitive data, important business operation, critical workflows, or a high level of integration, the customer will often view a simple 12-month fees cap as insufficient. The third weakness is that the formula fees paid in the previous 12 months creates a problem for newly signed contracts. If the incident happens early, the cap can be extremely low. That is why you often see variants such as fees paid or payable during the 12 months preceding the claim, or the greater or 12 months of fees paid or payable and a fixed minimum amount. That drafting avoids the absurd result of a newly signed contract with a near zero cap. When to use 12 months of fees? In my view, it is a very strong default position when the product is a standard SaaS offering, the product is reasonably mature, service commitments are properly controlled, the deal does not include unusually heavy implementation risk, the contractual relationship is recurring, and we are talking about the general cap, not the most sensitive carve-outs. So the right conclusion is this: 12 months of fees is often the right default starting point. It is not always the final answer, but it is a serious starting position. 3. The fixed amount when you need to move away from a revenue-based cap. A fixed amount looks simple, but it is actually more delicate than many people think. The main advantage of a fixed amount. Its first advantage is clarity. A cap of 250,000 euros, 500,000 euros, or 1 million euros give immediate visibility to legal, finance, management, any insurer, and the counterparty. The second advantage is that it avoids mechanical distortions. If fees are temporarily low, promotional, or poorly correlated with the real risk, a fixed amount can create a more sensible flow. The third advantage is that it can make sense in hybrid contracts where pricing does not properly reflect exposure. Examples include a low-cost pilot with sensitive use cases, a framework agreement with staged deployment, a contract where implementation services create more risk than the subscription itself, and a low revenue contract with high operational significance. So now, the weaknesses of a fixed amount. The first weakness is that it can become arbitrary. Why 250,000? Why 500,000? Why 1 million? If you do not have a clear internal logic, the number becomes hard to defend. The second weakness is that if the fixed amount is too high, it destroys economic proportionality. On the supplier side, that means carrying risks that may be structurally higher than the value generated by the deal. The third weakness is that it can age badly in a fast-growing account. A fixed amount may be too high at the beginning and too low after upsells, expansions, or renewals. When a fixed amount is the right tool. It is the right tool when fees are not a good proxy for risk. That is the real criterion. Not, I like fixed amounts, but rather, do the economics of this contract actually reflect the exposure I am being asked to accept? If the answer is no, then a fixed amount deserves serious consideration. 4. The multiple of fees, a compromise structure, but not a magic solution. A multiple of fees is often presented as the middle ground. For example, 2 times annual fees, 3 times fees paid in the previous 12 months, or 1.5 times the contract value over the initial term. Why this structure works in negotiation? Because it allows the customer to get more than a simple one-time annual fees cap, without immediately demanding a cap that is fully disconnected from the economics of the contract. From the supplier side, it is often more defensible than a very high fixed cap because the exposure still remains tied to the deal value. Now, the real problem with the multiple approach. A multiple can create an impression of sophistication, but it does not always solve the right problem, because multiplying a weak proxy still gives you a weak result. If the fee base is artificially low, 2 times or 3 times a low number may still be inadequate. And if the contract grows significantly, the multiple can expand exposure far beyond what the supplier actually intended to accept. There is another issue. A multiple is rarely neutral inside the business. Moving from 1 time to 2 times may sound reasonable in a single negotiation, but across an entire contract portfolio, it may double the maximum exposure on a whole category of deals. So, you should never think only on a deal-by-deal basis. You also need to think in terms of playbook and portfolio. Now, when a multiple is useful, it is useful when the customer has a credible materiality argument, when the supplier wants to remain in a proportional model, when the deal justifies an uplift above the standard position, when commercial leverage requires a credible concession, when the parties want to avoid a very aggressive fixed cap, or when you want an intermediate step before opening targeted supercaps. 5. The real method. How to choose properly. Now let's get to the actual question. How do you choose? I use personally a 6-step method. Step 1. Identify the nature of the contract. You need to classify the relationship first. Is it a standard self-serve or low-touch SaaS product, a mid-market SaaS deal, an enterprise deal, a heavily customized arrangement, a contract with material implementation services, a subscription plus services model, a pilot, or a contract that is operationally critical to the customer? You do not choose the same cap structure in each of those cases. Step 2. Test whether fees are a good proxy for risk. This is probably the most important step. Ask yourself this question. If I use contract fees as the basis for the cap, do I get a result that actually makes sense given the risk I am taking on? If the answer is yes, then starting with 12 months of fees makes sense. If the answer is no, then you should consider a floor, a fixed amount, a multiple, or a hybrid structure. Step 3. Separate the general cap from specific risk categories. Many negotiations go wrong because people try to make the general cap do all the work. That is a mistake. The general cap does not need to treat the following in exactly the same way: a confidentiality breach, an intellectual property claim, a data protection breach, fraud, gross negligence, if the governing law does not allow it to be limited, or bodily injury where relevant. In practice, the right kind of sophistication is not always to raise the general cap. Very often, the better answer is to keep a defensible general cap and introduce targeted supercaps or carve-outs for specific categories of risk. Step 4. Look at when the risk is likely to materialize. This point is often underanalyzed. The cap has to make sense in light of the timing of the contract. For example, if most of the serious risk can materialize within the first 3 months, a cap based strictly on fees paid in the previous 12 months can be a poor structure. In that situation, you may need fees paid or payable, annualized fees, the greater of a fixed amount and a fee-based amount, or a minimum floor. Step 5. Assess real negotiability. A cap is not chosen in the abstract. It is also chosen in light of customer size, competitiveness of the deal, closing pressure, dependence on the account, strategic significance of the relationship, the contract template in play, and internal risk appetite. A cap that looks theoretically perfect but cannot actually be negotiated in the commercial context is not a good practical choice. Step 6. Check insurability and internal governance. This final point is too often ignored. The cap should not be negotiated as if insurance, approval thresholds, and internal governance did not exist. A strong business lawyer does not only ask, what can we sign? The stronger question is, what can we sign in a way that remains consistent with our risk policy, insurance position, playbook, and overall contract portfolio? 6. My practical framework. Which structure I will choose in which situation. Let me make this concrete. Case 1. Standard SaaS, recurring subscription, moderate risk. My starting position is 12 months of fees paid or payable. Why? Because it is coherent, defensible, proportionate, and scalable. I do not move away from that general cap unless someone can show me that fees materially understate the risk. Case number 2. Newly signed contract, low fees so far, but real exposure. Here, I adjust the structure. For example, the greater of fees paid or payable over the previous 12 months and a fixed minimum amount. Other example, the greater of 100,000 euros and the fees paid or payable in the 12 months preceding the claim. Why? Because it avoids the absurd result of a very low cap in a newly signed contract. Case 3. Enterprise customer, meaningful operational sensitivity, but desire to remain proportionate. In that case, a multiple of fees can make sense. For example, 2 times annual fees for specific categories of risk, or 2 times the general cap if leverage requires movement. But in many cases, I will still rather reserve the multiple or super cap for targeted risk areas than inflate the entire general cap across the board. Case 4. Low pricing, but risk poorly correlated with fees. This is where a fixed amount becomes credible. Examples include a strategic pilot, low initial revenue, heavy implementation, sensitive data, and high operational dependence, for example. In that situation, relying only on annual fees can be intellectually lazy. I would prefer a reasoned fixed amount or a hybrid structure. Case number 5. Contract with clearly differentiated risk categories. This is often the most mature structure. I will typically recommend a layered approach. General cap, 12 months of fees, then privacy, confidentiality, or security super cap, 2 times that amount or a dedicated fixed amount. Then intellectual property carve out depending on the negotiated position. Then, non-excludable liabilities carved out as required by governing law. That is often much smarter than using one single inflated cap for everything. 7. What you absolutely need to avoid. There are several classic mistakes here. First mistake, using 12 months of fees as a reflex without testing the fee base. If fees do not reflect risk, the cap will be poorly calibrated. Second mistake, agreeing to a fixed amount with no clear logic. A number pulled out of the air is not a serious negotiation position. Every fixed amount should be defensible by reference to the nature of the risk, the economics of the contract, internal policy, and precedent across comparable deals. Third mistake, increasing the general cap instead of segmenting the risk. Very often, the general cap is not the right place to solve the problem. It is the exception structure that needs to be redesigned. Fourth mistake, ignoring the drafting mechanics of the clause. Because this issue also lives in the details of wording. Questions such as fees paid or paid and payable. 12 months before what exactly? The claim, the event, the first incident, the cause of action, cap per claim, or aggregate over the life of the agreement, cap per contract year, or one cumulative cap for the entire term. Does the cap extend to affiliates, subcontractors, employees, and officials? How does it interact with indemnities, service credits, refunds, and termination rights? These are not cosmetic drafting details. They are structural questions. 8. How I will defend each structure in negotiation. If I am defending 12 months of fees on the supplier side, I will say the liability cap needs to remain proportionate to the economic value of the contract. In a recurring SaaS model, tying the cap to 12 months of fees creates a reasonable alignment between revenue and contractual exposure. If there are specific categories of risks that justify differentiated treatment, we can discuss targeted carve-outs or supercaps, but we do not think it is appropriate to overinflate the general cap. If I am proposing a fixed amount, I would say, in this contract, fees are not a reliable proxy for the actual exposure, particularly given the structure of the engagement and the deployment phase. A fixed amount produces a more coherent and more transparent result for both parties. If I am offering a multiple of fees, I will say we can consider a limited multiple of fees in order to remain within a proportional framework while taking into account the sensitivity of the deal. What we want to avoid is a cap that is entirely disconnected from the economics of the transaction. 9. My practical position. If I had to summarize my view in one line, it will be this. I almost always start with 12 months of fees, then I test whether fees are a good proxy for risk. If they are not, I adjust the structure. I do not increase the cap mechanically. In other words, 12 months of fees when the contract is recurring, standardized, and economically coherent. a fixed amount when fees do not reflect the real exposure, a multiple of fees when movement is needed but the structure should remain proportional. And most importantly, I never treat the cap issue in isolation from carve-outs, supercaps, the exact drafting of the calculation base, and the real economics of the deal. Because a liability cap is not just a number, it is a risk allocation tool. And that is exactly where you can tell whether someone is simply reviewing clauses or whether they actually think like a business lawyer.